Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm back again with the private papers of a bankrupt bookseller, originally published in 1931. This is the fictional diary of a London bookseller. And today we are on page 55, beginning with the section titled Everybody's Doing It. Everybody nowadays, if a poor bookseller of very limited capital may be admitted to be a judge, writes books, or at least a book. It is a bad business for the bookseller. He has to buy them, for his customers ask for them, and he must sell books to live. In revenge, I sometimes think I will write a book, but I am deterred. I will not inflict myself on others. I will keep my little locked within my breast. I will be sunk without a trace. Piles of books, which I shouldn't have bought, provoke these reflections. I turn them over. The women are the worst, and remember Edward Gibbon. He writes at the time when he meditated authorship, sane words which every publisher might print on the back of his letters, which he has to send when he declined with thanks. Unprovided with original learning, uninformed in the habits of thinking, unskilled in the arts of composition, I resolved to write a book. Edward Gibbon adds that the discovery of his own weakness was the first symptom of taste. It would make an excellent title for an essay on the discovery of one's own weakness as an evidence of taste. It would be a good title for those authors who follow the reviving fashion of long titles. But what a restraining influence there ought to be in the experience of Edward Gibbon. Alas, the lesson is lost. A wicked generation seeketh ever some new thing, and the publishers must publish, and the bookseller must booksell in order to live. The next section is titled Anthology Buyers. For a desultory reader, the anthology is the gateway to literary ecstasy. I like the very word. Its etymology delighted me when I turned it up in one of the dictionaries. An anthology is a collection of choice poems, especially epigrams. The origin of the word is in the Greek anthologia, from anthos, a flower, and logia, a collection. Isn't that really pretty? A collection of flowers. I am fond of anthologies and rarely resist buying them. I have a lot, I am afraid, I will never sell. Anthologies do date, as the ladies' fashion specialist next door said surprisingly once about some outrageous hats which compelled a comment even from me. For all that, the first anthology I ever grew fond of is one which now I imagine is out of date. I have a copy, but care not either if I sell it. I read it often, from the 4 bold lines printed on its cover to the notes at the end. It is Lyra Heroica, a book of verse for boys, and the lines on the cover are the noble lines quoted by Sir Walter Scott in Old Mortality. Sound, sound the clarion, fill the fife, to all the sensual world proclaim, one crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. The preface, written by William Ernest Henley, who made the collection, is in keeping with the book, and this passage of prose, I think, matches anything really fine, though the contents are, that the book contains. Henley writes, "My purpose has been to choose and sheave a certain number of those achievements in verse, which, as expressing the simpler sentiments and the more elemental emotions, might fitly be addressed to some boys and men, for that matter, as are privileged to use our noble English tongue. To set forth, as only art can, the beauty and the joy of living, the beauty and the blessedness of death, the glory of battle and adventure, the nobility of devotion to a cause, an ideal, a passion even, the dignity of resistance, the sacred quality of patriotism, that is my ambition here." I wonder if any better preface has ever been penned to any book. I know of none, certainly. The contents range the evergreen and lovely fields of English poetry, from Shakespeare to Kipling. Some of the pieces I have and no other book on my shelf. This, from the Marquis of Montrose, was a deciding factor in the decision that made me become a bookseller. Little could James Graham have thought of that consequence, yet, please God, I am not the last any more than I was the first who was thrilled to act by the challenge of these 4 ringing lines. He either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small. Who dares not put it to the touch to gain or lose it all? I have always liked this book for that passage. It proves that poets are the real legislatures of the world. For James Graham made my fate as surely as he sang his own in that very verse. The book is full of good things, but I cannot make an anthology of this piece of writing by transcribing the whole book, verse for verse. For the love of it, I read again, and having reread, write note 6. Henley comments on those lines of Beaumont and Westminster Abbey. Here is an acre sown indeed, with the richest royalist seed that the earth did e'er suck in. And his comment includes that wonderful passage from Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, a book I have never seen, but would buy for these lines alone, even if it lay a lifetime on my shelves. O eloquent jest and mighty death, whom none could advise, thou hast persuaded, what none hath dared, thou hast done, and whom all the world hath flattered, thou only hath cast out of the world and despised, thou hath drawn together all the far-stretched greatness, all the pride, cruelty, and ambition of man, and covered it all over with these two narrow words, hic jacet. To me, that is just wonderful. My stock of anthologies does not stop at Lyra Heroica, though there is none I like better. I have songs and ballads of Greater Britain compiled by E.A. Helps, formerly one of the H.M. inspectors of schools. This is a good collection and an eye-opener, and a heart-opener too, to those who think English poetry was all written in England. To me, it is curious how prolific the Australians have been. The poetry in the collection is little known. Hardly a name is even familiar, but much of it deserves to be. This, to a sentimental bookseller, is delicately lovely. The song that once I dreamed about, the tender touching thing, as radiant as the rose without, the love of wind and wing, the perfect verses to the tune of woodland music set, as beautiful as afternoon, remain unwritten yet. That is by Henry Kendall. The standard anthologies of poetry and my bestsellers in Books of Pride are two Oxford books, the Oxford Book of English Verse and the Oxford Book of Victorian Verse. These are always in demand, and for the lover of poetry they are indispensable. It may be morbid, but my favorite poem, it is in both, is Non Nobis. The Victorian verse book gives the author as Henry Cust, but in the earlier book it is classified as anonymous. To us thou givest the scorn, the scrouge, the scar, the ache of life and the loneliness of death, the unsufferable sufficiency of breath. That last line, can anyone read it without feeling the tug of the chains that link him to the hours? I look among my shelves and on my display tables and see that I am well provided for the buyer of anthologies. I know the contents, or some of the contents of them all. I have Palgrave's Golden Treasury, a Routledge edition, heroic and patriotic verse in the Everyman series, The Realm of Poetry, published by Harrop, a most interesting introduction to the poetry, the 100 Best Lyrical Poems, and also, for I am up to date, an anthology of modern verse, which Methuen's published last year. With these, I am ready for any customer, if not to sell, at least to tell how each book is good. I confess I am a modern in poetry in spite of my first loves. If I were young again, and I could choose my anthology for the 20s, my choice would be the Anthology of Modern Verse. It is a modern, for the voice of the men who went to the war is over it, but it is not a voice with a martial tone. It is the voice of the fuller experience, the voice of men who saw life so greatly that they beheld life greatly. It is an anthology of large horizons, and so I think I would make it mine if I were 20 tomorrow and not an aging and amateurish seller of anthologies. I wish I might have a customer now. I wish it were a youth aged 20. I wish he would ask for an anthology. I wish that I might sell him one, and perhaps I would be making history. And that is the end of that section on anthologies and their buyers.